be too much? I know.
Yeah. Well, I think we're ready to begin. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So I'm John Singleton. I'm chairing the session, and this is a session titled, New Historical Perspectives on Women in Economics. And I want to go ahead and welcome you all to the session. So just a couple of logistical things. So these sessions are being run as webinars, which means that the participants are unfortunately unable to see the attendees, but they will be in communication over the Q&A and the chat potentially. So we can foster some discussion and Q&A that way. In particular, as the moderator or the chair of the session, I'm going to be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat, so we can use those to facilitate that. We're just going to proceed in the order that is listed on the conference program, with Giandomenica Becchio's paper first, and then Dan Hirschman's paper, and then Erin, Hengel, Sarah, Louisa, and Christopher's paper. Christopher will be presenting the paper to follow. We're going to set a hard upper limit of 25 minutes each per presentation, which I imagine will be sufficient. I'll go ahead and keep time and keep you guys hopefully on schedule. Sometimes not so good, but what we're going to do is going to save discussion and question and answers till the end. So I encourage you, as questions come up or you have a question, to go ahead and put those in the chat or in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end that we can return to all those. So before we dive right into it with our first paper, I did want to say a few words just about the session and the conference, of which the session is sort of a small instantiation. So for those who are perhaps not aware, the journal, The History of Political Economy, which is published by Duke University Press, sponsors an annual conference called the History of Political Economy Conference, which a selection of papers then become a part of a edited volume released as an annual supplement to the journal. And so this has been going on for a number of years. And what we've proposed is what will be occurring later this year in July, hopefully, will be that conference, and then the papers will be edited and will appear part of that volume. That conference to be titled New Historical Perspectives on Women in Economics. And so the three papers today are going to be part of that conference, in addition to 8 to 10 other papers that have been proposed. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the motivation for that conference and sort of the goals and aims of that. So I'm one of the co-organizers of that forthcoming conference, along with Cleo Chassanery-Zagouche and Evelyn Faget. And at the outset, from the kind of conversations the three of us had, the idea was we wanted to stimulate the production of new knowledge on the trajectory, the intellectual content, and the practices of economics as a discipline, with a particular focus on work that would encourage and integrate historical developments informed by both women's history and gender studies, that would focus on sort of three aspects of women and the economics discipline in the 20th century specifically. On the one hand, we were interested in fostering work on the status and experience of women themselves in the economics profession. And so you see some of the papers today, we'll touch on that theme. In addition, the specificity of women economists' ideas and practices, right? You talk about categories such as a feminine way of thinking about economics, or feminist economics even. And then also finally, the production of knowledge regarding women in the economy itself, right? We've seen the growth of what we call gender economics and sort of especially the recent history. Giandomenica will talk a little bit about this as well. And so we kind of see those as kind of three, unified themes, but also some distinct areas that we're hoping to encourage work. And so, in our view as the organizers, these kinds of conferences are sort of most successful when they help foster a sort of growing or new community to push work in kind of a new direction and to serve as sort of a waypoint for these new kinds of analysis, or kind of an emerging consensus, or some kind of consensus that this is an important set of issues to be working on. And so, I think we'll evaluate whether the conference eventually is successful on those kinds of terms, the degree to which it, kind of creates this new community of people who are working on these related areas and are pushing the discipline of history of economics and the history of economic thought in those directions. So with that little preface about the conference and what this session is all about, I'll step aside and go ahead and turn it over to our first paper presenter, Giandomenica Becchio. If you want to go ahead and share your screen, we'll get started.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Sorry. Here it is. So can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful.
Yes.
So thank you. Thanks so much for having me today. So as John mentioned before, in this paper, which is a part of the broader project that just described by John, I will try to describe the tension and the contraposition between feminist economics and gender and neoclassical economics by using the theory of marriage, and particularly Barbara Bergmann's contribution on the theory of marriage. So the aim of this paper is to highlight the differences between the two approaches. Very quickly, what I intend for, which is the main difference between gender neoclassical economics and feminist economics. Well, gender neoclassical economics adopts a neoclassical, a standard economic theory to deal with gender issues, while feminist economics reject neoclassical and standard economics to deal with gender issues in economics. So I'm going to find their differences by coping with the theory of marriage as a case study. And I'm using basically Barbara Bergmann's contribution, and in particular her unpublished works, which are held at her archive, which is at Duke University at Perkins Library. In general, Barbara Bergmann was one of the most important, one of the founding mother of feminist economics. She devoted her life entirely to the study of segregation and inequality, either regards to gender as well as to race. And as we see, she was she was working on 3 different projects, which partially remained unpublished. And all these new research projects were focused on the theory of marriage and the connection between theory of marriage and childcare and so forth. So we'll see how I mean later. So let's start with a brief description of what is the institution of marriage. We have two opposite approach to consider the institution of marriage. One approach considers marriage as the most traditional way to protect women by providing them a family, housing, and a social status. On the opposite side, in social sciences, marriage has been seen as the main tool to oppress women, as the main tool to reinforce patriarchy. Why? Because marriage perpetrated the relegation of women in their role of wives and in their subjected social roles. Because legal rights were absolutely delegated to husbands. And as we know, women, also political rights were delegated to husbands. We know that human suffrage came very right after the male suffrage. And last but not least, also their economic independence were denied and again delegated to the breadwinner, the husband. This is in general for the institution of marriage within social science. In particular, in economic theory, the theory of marriage has been declined into different way of study, of research. The first is the way in which neoclassical economics, gender neoclassical economics, deals with marriage. And generally speaking, we can say that gender neoclassical economics tried to explain the rationale behind the traditional institution of marriage, which was based, and still is, on the division of roles between the two partners by adopting the so-called separate spheres. So on one side we have the husband, the breadwinner, and on the other side we have the wife, who is a housewife and a mother. This is mainly due because of their different human capital acquired by men and women. On the other side, the theory of marriage in economic theory may be dealt by feminist economics, which try to explain the inequality and the unfairness of this traditional division of labor between spouses, of this traditional intra-house allocation, bargaining, and so forth, and relationship. So let's try to describe briefly the roots of the neoclassical economics way of dealing with the theory of marriage. And of course, we have to start with Becker's work, who dealt with the economics of marriage in several writings during the 70s, published during the 70s, and then in his broader treatise of family, published in 1982. So I'm almost taking for granted that everybody knows what I'm talking about. According to Becker, the division of labor between partners within the household is a consequence of the human capital theory, which usually leads to an optimal sorting model. Becker applied the theory of competitive advantages to explain in more specific way this division of labors between partners. Some premises, some methodological premises in Becker's were that the sexual division of labor is also not only a consequence of the human capital theory, or better say, the human capital theory is a consequence of the biological differences between women and men. And their biological differences usually lead them to spend their time in different ways, because their time are not perfect substitutes, but complementary. So the notion of Becker, the notion of marriage, according to Becker, is a long-term commitment to assure women protection, and this can be observed by the very beginning of the process of education of children. It's very rational, according to Becker, to specialize investments on education in a different way. So boys should be, the education of boys should be specialized towards market-oriented investment, while girls, the education of girls should be specialized as a household-oriented education. This is a very optimal strategy, according to Becker, to get the highest return for the society as a whole. As we know, according to Becker, household presents one single utility function, which is supposed to be maximized given a budget constraint. And this utility function is composed of the sum of all family income, which is the representation of a benevolent father, head of the family, who is benevolent for sure, and is able to make fair decisions, make fair choices. According to Becker, what is divorce? Divorce may be efficient when an increment of utility, when it provides an increment of utility if compared with staying married. And Becker went on by considering possible causes of the divorce, such as larger than expected deviation between actual and expected earnings in staying married with that particular person, discrepancies between partners regarding intelligence, social background, religion, race, and so forth. Summing up, according to Becker, a good way to define marriage is to consider it a special case of cause theorem. After Becker, many more economists followed his perspective. For example, Phelps, she tried to mitigate somehow Becker's biological premise explanation by introducing love and caring as fundamental elements for the equilibrium of the household. And so she introduced in the utility function of the household the element happiness. And according to Phelps, I'm talking about Charlotte Phelps, she considered a marriage a happier institution than remaining single. She compared families with firms, and she introduced, she kept on by considering the negotiation costs between partners while they are deciding to get married, although she admitted, as I told you before, that somehow some gender norms may be very effective in the formation of the couple. Another example is the contributed by Sherry, who introduced fairness in the marriage market, and partially as Charlotte Phelps, she considered the influence of power relations and extra economic factors in the building up of a family. It's important that the contribution of Lundberg is also important because she introduced inequalities between partners, and she refused to consider gender specialization in marriage by adopting a joint consumption model. That is a more technical difference with Baker. And finally, Shoshana Grossbard introduced his own model, which presents some differences with Baker's. She was particularly careful in the element of conflict about intra-house allocation. But still, she considered marriage as a firm where husbands are seen as employers and wives as workers. She was very careful in considering the composition of the household utility function by claiming that family members must be considered as independent decision makers. and more important, they don't necessarily cooperate, as was implicit in Baker's model. And she also introduced the institutional framework as influential on families' members' behavior. And that's particularly important when analyzing the spread of divorce. So let's go to the other side of the story, the feminist economics theory of marriage. Of course, feminist economics...
About 10 minutes left. 10 minutes.
10 minutes left, okay. Means a combination between feminism and economic theory. As I told you before, feminist economics rejects neoclassical economics. I'm skipping the part of the division between classical liberal feminist and radical feminist, because either way, they consider the effect of marriage on women as root or a possible source of inequality. Why? Because the traditionally gender division of labor has been always disadvantaged women. So basically, feminist philosophy, upon which feminist economics is grounded, is a way to fight against the doctrine, the so-called doctrine of separate spheres that I mentioned before. There are three different nuances in this fight against the doctrine of separate spheres. The first one is that there are no essential differences between men and women. Differences are only shaped by culture and society. The second nuance is that there are differences. Women effectively are more inclined in caring, love, and so forth, but the society traditionally has underestimated care work. And then there is the third nuance, which claims that no matter which is the reason behind the differences between men and women, the reality is that the masculine way upon which the society has been shaped has damaged women. So feminist economics, before going to Barbara Bergmann, provides a model able to include the care work, love, power, obligation, and the role of extra economic factors such as cultural and social norms. Feminist economics reject the Newbergian marriage theory a la Becker. And here you have a list of one of the most important feminist economists who dealt with marriage theory. For example, Folbre, who assumed that altruism, who claimed that by assuming that altruism prevails in families is very problematic and is inconsistent with the idea of homo economicus, because it is supposed to be selfish and competitive. Boserup noticed that the application of the rational choice theory to the supposed lower marginal productivity of women's labor justified the idea of the inferiority of women. So it's as if the neoclassical gender economics reinforced the subjection of women. Strober criticized Grossbard the idea that marriage and employment are substitute, and Julie Nelson, of course, spent most of the time by criticizing Becker's approach to economics, considering it as much more to do with the comforts of the orthodoxy rather than to a real research on marriage. And then Barbara Bergmann. Barbara Bergmann was a classical liberal feminist. She claimed clearly that the only possible ticket to equality, to gender equality, is a total androgyny model. So a totally androgyny model, sorry, there's a typo, on male style. So gender equality may be attained only when women will join the male work. But this is a project which requires a specific policy, a specific affirmative action. And this is part of the policy of the job of policymakers. The gender discrimination, according to Barbara Bergmann, in the labor force, either in the labor force and in the family, are the two faces of the same coin, gender inequalities. which was labeled by Bergmann as a sex role case system. As I mentioned before, there are 3 different unpublished projects. The first is dated in 1981. It's an unpublished book outlined in 11 chapters on the economic calculation of raising children. She was in particular very careful about the situation of single mothers. And she proposed some welfare measures for these specific families. There are 2 more books, much more recent. The first one is was outlined in 2003. It was more specifically focused on single mothers rather than on raising children. It was basically the same, the opposite face of the same coin. And again, she provides some policies of welfare in order to propose an agenda for single motherhood. And then there is a very specific research project which is undated, but it partially went to a working paper that was published in 2008, and this is her last research project. It's a book. It was supposed to be a book on the decline of the institution of marriage. She was absolutely obsessed with the fact that in the last 3 decades, the institution of marriage has been declined dramatically. And she was very worried because the effect of this decline of the institution of marriage somehow will harm the society as a whole and will be very dangerous for the new generation, for children who were growing up. In these particular notes, she attacked Becker as well as his followers on the specific point of the decline of marriage that for them was caused by new technologies. And of course, Bergmann absolutely denied this explanation, this very naive explanation, by using her own words. And again, she proposed some social welfare measures for some specific programs. And these social welfare measures would require a consistent raise of taxes for the middle class in the US. So she was very aware of the problematic acceptance of her own proposal. And so I'm concluding. I don't know if I'm running out of time. So I'm concluding here, and I'm just saying that the theory of marriage very, very quickly is a case to somehow understand the different approach of the gender neoclassical economics and feminist economics. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Giandomenica. It was great. So we'll, as I said from the outset, if you arrived late, we're going to save questions and discussion till the very end. So either if you have a question now, either write it down or put it in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll make sure, provided we have the time, that we return to it at the end of the presentations. With that said, let's go ahead and move on to our second presentation, which is going to be presented by Christopher Brunet. I'll turn it over to you, Chris, to go ahead and share your screen.
Cool. Perfect. So, good afternoon. My name is Christopher Brunet, and I'm here presenting a historical analysis of economic research by women, along with Dr. Erin Hengel and Sarah Louisa Phythian-Adams, both at Liverpool. I'm going to go right ahead and jump right into the first slide, which is what our data looks like. So We expand upon the data set used in Hengel and Moon. So we added an extra journal, economic journal, and several additional decades worth of data. So ultimately, we're left with 23,000 articles spanning from 1940 to 2019. And the reason why we chose these 6 journals is because we chose the top 5 and then added economic journal. Because at the time our data set began in 1940, economic journal was widely considered to be the preeminent general interest economic journal. And in all of these articles, there's something like 17,000 authors. And for each author, we hand-coded their gender. So this was mostly determined by their first name, which is standard in the literature, but also plenty of detective work. So Googling their obituaries and their personal websites, and ultimately you're left with less than 1% of unknown genders. Now, I'm going to show you what the data looks like a little bit. This is just to get you used to it. And the figures on the right were built by aggregating author counts by year and by sex and by journal. And the lines were built simply by quadratic curve estimation. What is good is that we found the same trends that are present in Hengel 2020, Hengel and Moon 2020, and Carolyn Kraft has the same figures as well in a project that she's currently working on. The long run trend is rising. You can see it's starting to go exponential, maybe, but it's still pretty low. On the bottom right panel there, you'll see that in our most recent year of data, 2019, female share of authorship was right around 17%. Now, if we were to break this down by co-authoring trends, as a so 1 author versus 2 author versus 3 author versus 4+ authors, the main takeaway here is simply that there's been a tremendous downfall in solo authored papers, which has been met with a concurrent rise in co-authored papers, especially in the past decade or two. There's been a huge rise in 3 and 4 author papers for the first time. If we were now to break this down into, so this is every author, every paper, but if we were to break it down into papers that are exclusively male authored and papers that were exclusively female authored, it looks like this. And these figures are a little bit striking. They speak for themselves almost. So they're not in percentage terms. The last slide was in percentage terms, but this is just in absolute number of articles published by each segregated subset of the data. So female authorship, the solo female papers have been pretty steady at just a handful every year for the entirety of our data set. But what I would point your attention to is just like right at the very end here, you can kind of see female teams starting to form. And this gets to my point of emerging female teams, emerging female networks. That is a very recent phenomenon, really. And in a few slides, we're going to touch on that again. Last visualization of the data. So, sorry. Now, the solo males are going down just as you would expect them to, because they follow the trend of less solo authored papers. And the solo female authors are flat, just as you would expect them to, or just as we showed before. But the interesting thing here again is that the female teams, once again, are just now, over the past decade or two, starting to emerge. So female co-authorship teams as opposed to male co-authorship teams. And the mixed teams, the one at the very bottom right here, this is showing that so solo females has been flat, female teams have been more or less non-existent. And so the way women have been publishing in the top 5 journals is by co-authoring with teams that include a male. And, oh, sorry, if we zoom up, see on the top right panel here, the solo female, it's showing the y-axis is 0 to 100%, but if we were to scrunch in a little bit, you can see this is what it looks like. It's still hovering around 3 or 4 or 5%. But what we found interesting was what we, in our paper, we call the Ursula Hicks effect, because she was the first female editor of a major economics journal. And it's we don't want to say that she directly caused double or triple the amount of female co-authors or female authors in that journal during that time, but that is what we see in the data. Now that we've explored the data a little bit, we're going to jump now into network analysis, which is kind of the cool, interesting part of our paper. So we have our data where the males, we turn the authors into nodes, and we turn the co-authorship connections into edges. And the idea is that articles link researchers to one another in a co-authorship network. And the reason why this is important to study is because top 5, top 6 publications have a very powerful influence on tenure decisions. There's a nice paper by Heckman and Mocktan, which just came out last year, that is called The Tyranny of the Top 5. And it talks about the tyranny of the top 5. Now, in the next couple slides, we're going to get into networks, and we're going to show you some networks. But we're careful not to say anything too conclusive about causality, or we're careful not to say anything too definitive about causality, simply because the biggest weakness of a network approach in the network econometrics literature is endogeneity. So networks get messy really, really fast if you're trying to say anything definitive about, especially statistical discrimination. So we have some bullet points there, if you would like to read them, that talk about some of the reasons why endogeneity is such a problem. Now, while that may be a weakness, the greatest strength of networks, in our opinion, is just simply the power of visualization. So they can be turned into beautiful artwork that can tell the story. And that brings me to my next slide. This is what our network looks like when it's laid out. So this is every article, every author, every journal, and every year, where the blue nodes are males, the pink nodes are females, and the bigger a node is, the more that author has published. So for example, in the very, very center here, those really, really big nodes, that would be ASSA and Stiglitz. And actually, the biggest female node that we have, or the most, would be this one where my mouse is right here. That's Joan Robinson, actually. And the reason why she did publish a bunch of papers, so she is weighted correspondingly, but because she was publishing so long ago, she didn't really co-author very much, so she doesn't have very many connections. In any case, this is laid out in a modified Fruchterman-Reingold layout. The reason why we chose Fruchterman-Reingold is because it's one of the most mainstream methods in the networks literature, and you would kind of need a better reason to choose something else. Now, the reason why it's a modified Fruchterman-Reingold layout is because if you just run the vanilla Fruchterman-Reingold layout, it gets very, very tangled and clustered and messy and just looks like a big ball of nodes. So what we did is we kind of tweaked it, played around with it until we built these rings. So there's an outer ring of mostly solo male authors. There's an inner ring where most of the female authors are. And there's a inner kind of dense cluster where all the real, really tangled co-authorship networks are taking place. What I would draw your attention to here is if you really look where my mouse is right here, there's just starting to see like a smattering of females in that network. And we're going to expand on that in a couple of slides from now. If we take this network and we segregate it by gender. So the one on the left here is exclusively male, obviously, and the one on the right is exclusively female. Once again, these figures kind of speak for themselves, I would say. The one on the left is very, very dense, highly connected, very developed network. And the one on the right is not. It's very sparse, very undeveloped. You can see some little baby networks hovering around in there. And there's one big network here, which I'm gonna zoom up on in the next slide. It is actually the largest exclusively female sub-network of co-authors in the existence of our data set. This is what it looks like. The largest female sub-network ever. So this is a ring, or sorry, it's a hybrid network, because there's a ring here, an inner ring network of really prominent names. I'm not going to walk through them all, A, B, C, D, and E. You can read them. But I'm sure most of you have heard of everyone. And the reason why it's a hybrid network is because surrounding this ring are trees and branches. And these represent networks that are just now, like just now starting to form. And there's a whole network on, there's a whole literature, sorry, on network formation, how networks are formed, how networks are developed. And this is networks starting to develop for the first time. More than anything, just kind of a cool graph. So a couple slides ago, we broke it down by male and female exclusive networks. Now we break that down by male and female per decade. And the story that these graphs is telling is that while the male networks have been highly developed, like right from the start, basically, the female networks are lagging way behind. And just by looking, like visually looking at them, you can kind of tell that not only are they, well, they are starting to develop, but that's a very recent phenomenon. So for most of the history of our data set, women co-authored with men or women solo authored, and only in the past couple of decades have women begun to co-author with each other and publish as teams. So kind of the story we're telling here with this figure is that networks are starting to emerge. And supporting this story is our table below, which is just metrics of the network. My favorite metric is the connected components one, which is the row with the circled red lines. This is a measure of density and connectivity, I should say. And you can think of this metric as kind of counting all the different combinations and permutations of how networks are connected to each other via paths. And so if you see right here in the most recent decade, the 2010s, there's 742 connected components, which is roughly equal to what the male network was at 80 years ago. So a very crude interpretation might be that women are 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 years behind men in terms of developing their co-author networks. So that's a quantitative look, kind of, at the networks. But if we now turn to a qualitative look, in our paper, we talked a little bit about another paper by Evelyn Forget, which was written in 2011. This is a paper that describes the 4 phases that women have gone through in the economics discipline over the past century. Phase 1 would be before 1918, when women were a minority and just started to gain PhDs for the first time. Actually, what we found when we were doing our background research for this project was a lot of the obituaries in 1940 and 1950, almost everyone, not almost everyone, but a lot of them had PhDs from Bryn Mawr. So really the place that was pumping out female PhDs in the 1918s, or back in the day, was Bryn Mawr. And we identified that as a sub-network of, we identify it as an important sub-network. Phase 2 would be the interwar years, so during and after World War II. Women were funneled into related disciplines, not economics per se, but things like social work or home economics or federal government projects, and were largely used as cheap labor and cheap computing power. In phase 3, which would be the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, women started really showing up in applied economics fields, but often in support positions. So once again, we found a lot of women that were kind of lifelong assistants or lifelong RAs. For example, in the last presentation, actually, she spoke about Gary Becker. And we looked at Gary Becker's most famous books, and each of them, a lot of the grunt work turned out to be done by lifelong female research assistants, for example. And that's acknowledged like in the book, but it's still kind of a hidden contribution, we would say. Another example of this, which we found, was the Cobb-Douglas. So Cobb and Douglas, from the infamous Cobb-Douglas production function. They had a couple women as well that spent their entire adult lives just running numbers on Cobb-Douglas production functions, but were always behind the scenes, never got any credit. They were just assistants to Cobb and Douglas for their whole lives. So that's just kind of a microcosm of this phase that was identified by Forget. Phase 4 that Forget identified was since 1970, when third wave feminism really started to hit and social barriers started falling. That's when we started seeing women actually be represented for the first time in upper echelons of professions like economics. Now, the reason why I walked through these 4 phases, 1, 2, 3, and 4, is because this is what we put forward in our paper, is that we have identified a 5th post-2010s or 2010s emergent networks phase for women. And we talk about how that builds upon the work of Forget, it extends it, and we add a 5th phase. And I hope I didn't speak too fast. I kind of motored through a lot of that, but that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm done.
That's great, and you're right on time. Yeah, thanks, Christopher. That was great. Really cool to see those figures. As I mentioned, between our last presentations, we're going to save Q&A and discussion for the end. I see that some of the Q&A is getting populated with questions. That's great. We'll make sure that we have a good discussion at the end that addresses all those. So I want to go ahead now and turn it over to our last presenter, Dan Hirschman. Dan, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Yes. Shall I start? Thank you all so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about some work that's part of a larger book project. This is one of the chapters, and each chapter in the book is about a sort of different economic statistic, and it's kind of history both within academia and then kind of public understandings of that number. And this chapter in particular focuses a lot more on the public side of this. So you'll see a little bit less of the kind of history of academic economics. That's an important sort of part of the story, and a little more of the sort of public understanding, and in some cases misunderstanding. So you're probably used to seeing figures like this one that dramatize a particular calculation, which is known typically as the gender wage gap or the gender earnings gap. And it reports the sort of average wages of full-time working women as compared to full-time working men, not controlling for pretty much anything else. And this number has become arguably the most important stand-in for gender equality in the economy, or certainly one of them. And I'm going to do in this talk is talk about sort of the history of these kinds of numbers. You see them deployed in all sorts of places. For example, social movements have picked up the gender wage gap and transformed it to sort of remark the calendar and create an equal pay day, where every year there's a single day where women have been sort of working for free up to that point, in the sense that the average woman would need to work that much more to equal the wage of the average man. This kind of rhetoric and these numbers are also linked to particular policies, such as the Paycheck Fairness Act that related to employers threatening to penalize workers for sharing their pay information in an effort to reduce gender inequality, and things of that sort. You see also there's a lot of that these kind of numbers are frequently brought up in the news, and they're often a site where policy gets linked up to academic conversation. So you'll see in a sort of typical article about sort of policy or political debate over a gender equality related law, a link to the gender wage gap. That is, the gender wage gap is like the target for the law. And so, for example, early in the Trump administration, there was a proposed rule from the Obama era that they sort of were going to halt around paycheck fairness. And in the sort of related articles in places like the New York Times and Washington Post, they would frequently turn to an economist like Francine Blau to contextualize the gender wage gap and its meaning. And so there's an example of the kind of discourse you see frequently in discussions of the gender wage gap in public. They turned to Francine Blau, an economist at Cornell, who found that women's career decisions account for about 60% of the gap, while about a third is left unexplained, which leaves rooms for employer bias, unconscious or otherwise. The details here are not what I want to get at here, but it's that the way that the sort of policy conversation, the kind of media perception, and the academic research are sort of brought together through this particular number and debating its significance and meaning. And there's plenty to debate. I also want to highlight, because it'll come up a lot at the end, the way that women's decisions are often foregrounded in these conversations. That's going to become an important theme, especially for the sort of recent period. As I said, social movement activists, sort of the feminist movement organizations, emphasize the gender wage gap and have for decades. For example, the American Association of University Women puts out a report frequently about the gender wage gap, and conservative columnists, authors, and organizations like the EAI will put out kind of like rebuttal op-eds and things, calling the pay equity crisis mythical, and saying that the wage gap is just a myth. You have to ignore lots of variables to pretend that women are paid less than men. Part of what's happening here is that even though there's a single number, the gender wage gap, that sort of everyone kind of agrees on, the actual meaning of that and its connection to the law and sort of the moral questions of equality between men and women is tightly contested. There's a lot of talking past each other that's sort of built into this conversation, a kind of systematic misunderstanding or miscommunication in some ways. And so in this talk, what I want to do is sort of pull back and ask, what kind of a thing is the gender wage gap? Like, what is this an example of? And how are things like this made? How do they circulate both within academia and then outside of it? What kind of work do they do publicly and politically? And what can we learn by studying these things, in particular for the importance of social scientific description? One of the larger arguments of the project is that we spend a lot of time as sort of sociologists and historians studying economics focused on sort of big theories and big causal claims, but actually some of the most important work that social scientists do, and economists in particular, is quantitative description, putting numbers on social relations. And those numbers can have a lot of powerful effects, even if the kind of explanations that the economists or sociologists might attach to those numbers don't always travel quite as far as the numbers themselves. So in this talk, what I'm going to argue is that we can think of the gender wage gap as an example of a stylized fact, a term that's probably familiar to most of you, but I'll spend a little bit of time sort of explaining how I think it works within economics, how these, and sociology to some extent. I'll argue that stylized facts kind of substitute for phenomena within academic economics. That is, they're the thing that becomes to be explained, but they also sort of travel out and shape policy and public discourse, sometimes disconnected from those explanations within academia. And the interpretations of these stylized facts change over time and are shaped by both the kind of academic theory conversation, but also what you might call folk economics, that is sort of everyday understandings of how economic life works. And as a result, questions that are made in the process of creating a description, like what exactly you control for, and other kinds of technical choices about sample construction and things like this are both technical, but also simultaneously deeply political kinds of choices. And I can talk about other examples at the end if people are interested, but basically there's no particular obvious reason why this exact measure becomes the sort of most important measure for discussing gender inequality. And the fact that it did have particular consequences that we chose in some sense to control for full-time work, but nothing else, creates some of the kinds of tensions in the debates over the number. So in the talk, I'll first sort of lay out how I think about stylized facts. Then I'll talk about folk economics and sort of how sociologists think about ideology more generally and explanations of inequality, and then do sort of a history of the gender wage gap as it emerged. And then at the end, I'll briefly talk about some implications if I have time. So by a stylized fact, what do I mean? I mean an empirical regularity in need of an explanation. So it's usually a claim by a social scientist, most often an economist, that here is some aspect of the social world that is roughly stable and important enough to be worth explaining. Examples include correlations, trends, and sort of rates of incidence, which you can think of as non-trends. And I've listed examples here from various literatures in political science and in economics and sociology of claims that are made in the literature that I think fit this definition. So democracies rarely go to war with each other is a kind of correlational claim. The share of profits going to finance has risen dramatically is a kind of trend claim, and a claim you'll see some places in sociology, demography, psychology, 1 in 10 people are gay, as a rate of incidence assumed to not change over time. What's important here is that all these kinds of claims are explicitly not causal. They're not telling you why any of these things are happening. But they're also a kind of normative as well as descriptive claim. That is, they're a claim that here is something important, here is something stable enough or interesting enough as a trend to be worth our time to explain. And then finally, while each of these kinds of claims uses sort of has a technical definition and often is connected to a particular kind of data or data set, they're also simultaneously non-technical in the sense that they use terms that are circulating every day. And so what a researcher might mean by profits or finance or democracy or war or gay might be sort of precisely linked to a particular data set. That link may get blurred as the number and its sort of moves out into public and political conversation where the term may have other meanings. There's some great history behind each of these numbers and how those things have happened, but I'll talk specifically about the gender wage gap today. So what do stylized facts do? So I'd say within academia, I think they do sort of 3 main things. One is that they sort of substitute for phenomena. That is, as social scientists, we rarely have access to a way to sort of push on the world and get it to reliably push back. Instead, what we have are aggregates of statistical data, and we look for patterns and trends that seem stable enough. And so they become the things that models explain. And again, in economics, it's sometimes very explicit. A paper will say, we produce a model that explains these 3 stylized facts about whatever. In other fields, I think the same thing is happening, but it's often less explicit in the language, sociology, for example. And these stylized facts tend to emphasize sort of a signal in otherwise noisy data. But politically, I think stylized facts also travel out and empower various kinds of political claims. You see actors mobilizing around them, often linked up with causal theories that may or may not have anything to do with how social scientists think about those same relationships. We can even see them reshaping social identities, as we see with, for example, the movement to create a calendar around equal pay day. Finally, I think they act as a kind of hinge, as we saw in that opening vignette, where they connect the kind of research conversation to the political and public conversation through the hinge or through the sort of doorway of these particular numbers that everyone is sort of focused around, explaining their patterns or non-patterns. So in this particular talk, what I'm going to focus on is the gender wage gap. And here I have 2 more precise research questions, one of which is how do people make sense of economic gender inequality? And then what role do academics' quantitative descriptions play in shaping that understanding? And to answer these questions, I'm going to draw on some ideas from very distinct parts of sociology I'll spend a little bit of time on that are kind of how sociologists think about sort of the ideologies of economic life or of inequality. And so first, there's been some recent conversations which surround the idea of folk economics, people's basic lay understandings of what causes what and why in the economy. And so in some sense, you can see this whole project is sort of contributing to the folk economics of gender and gender inequality. Drawing from sociology of law literature, I'm interested in a concept called legal consciousness, which has to do with the way in which people experience, understand, and act in relation to law. One of the things I saw in the data as I was researching this project, which isn't surprising in light of this literature, is just how strongly the law shapes people's understandings of how the economy works. In particular, what we'll see is that the Equal Pay Act and its definition of discrimination being around different pay for the exact same job strongly shapes the conversation around what kinds of inequality we think are unacceptable and what we think these numbers mean even when they don't. From the sociology of gender, I draw on the concept of soft essentialism. This is a kind of gender ideology or belief system that simultaneously assumes there are sort of natural differences between boys and girls, but also valorizes the liberal feminist idea of individual choice for girls and women. So the idea is that women and men have sort of systematic differences in their preferences, but we should be encouraging women to make to have the full range of possible choices. And this sort of contrasts with the harder essentialism of days past. And then finally, from the sociology of race, I think it applies nicely in gender context, I draw on the concept of abstract liberalism, which describes a kind of vague support for equality, understood primarily as equality opportunity, combined with concrete opposition to policies that might actually bring that equality about, would require seemingly illiberal state intervention to do so. That is to say, this is an ideology that says racial inequality is bad, but the state should not take aggressive action to do anything about it, for example. And you see something sort of similar happening with how people sort of understand and talk about gender inequality as being problematic, but also sort of not sort of accepting the idea that let me put it another way, but believing that most of it results from particular choices made by individuals, and that it'd be sort of wrong for the state to do much about that. And these kinds of larger ideological systems or tendencies that have been prominent for the last few decades, I think strongly shape the conversation around the gender wage gap and sort of what bits of the formal research make it into public life and how they do so. So moving on to the history of the number itself, the gender wage gap's relatively new. You start really seeing it only in the 1960s and 70s. Before that, there is, of course, intense discussion around gender inequality and gender earnings inequalities, but they don't take the form of this particular number. In part, that's because as women increasingly entered the paid workforce, much of the conversation was around occupational exclusion and segregation. Men and women simply did not work in the same jobs for the most part. This starts to change, especially with World War II, as women briefly enter into many male-dominated occupations, and there's intense debates around whether or not women can be paid different rates for those jobs, and politics around that so in some ways unite and in some ways divide sort of labor feminists and liberal feminists. Post-World War II, for about 20 years, labor feminists sort of pick up or try to continue the momentum of World War II into pushing for strong equal pay legislation, both the national and state levels. Notably, throughout this period, they recognized the problem that women and men mostly worked in different occupations. And so they always pushed for laws that required equal pay for so-called work of comparable value or comparable work. The idea here was that women and men often did work that was equally difficult or onerous or skilled, but the jobs that were women's were paid less. And so what the law should do is rectify that discrimination. Again, still kind of assuming or acknowledging the extensiveness of occupational segregation. When in 1963, the Equal Pay Act actually passes at the federal level in the United States, because of the sort of political compromises needed to get it passed, it ends up only requiring equal pay for equal work, not work of comparable value. So only two jobs that have basically the exact same title and responsibilities are required to pay the same amount. Work that is comparable but distinct in any way does not fall under the prohibitions of the Equal Pay Act. The next year, the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is passed, which offers much more expansive protections around gender discrimination, but which has a proviso that says it doesn't override the Equal Pay Act. And so it does not allow for sort of new claims around pay, but rather only sort of reinforces what the Equal Pay Act has already done. At the same time, within economics, this is sort of the takeoff of sort of a new era of labor economics, and especially the rise of survey microdata and the emergence of so-called earnings regressions. That is, for the first time, economists are really looking heavily at how individual people actually make their money and what the correlates of that are. And we actually, nicely follows from two previous presentations around the rise of kind of Becker's work and various other forms of that sort of new kind of economics. So into this moment, we get the first sort of calculations of the modern gender wage gap. And the first one I can actually find is in a dissertation published in 1960 with an article published a few years later by Chicago grad Henry Sanborn. Published a paper in ILR Review titled Pay Differences Between Men and Women. And what's fascinating here is that Sanborn calculates the kind of modern pay gap of X cents on the dollar. At the time, it was about 59 cents on the dollar, in order to immediately explain it away. And so what he does in the paper is tries to identify the amount of discrimination that results from lower pay to women than to men for the same work. That is the sort of discrimination that would be illegal under the Equal Pay Act. And by the end of the paper, after doing the analysis and looking at various kinds of other variables like years of experience and education, argues that a strong degree of employer discrimination against women does not seem plausible from this evidence. That is, he calculates the gender wage gap at the beginning of the paper and uses the rest of the paper to explain it away as not resulting from illegal discrimination. This is a kind of unexpected history, at least to me, for a number that becomes kind of a rallying cry for the feminist movement a few years later. But at the same time as Sanborn's doing this sort of work in academic journals, the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor also begins calculating and circulating that same kind of modern gap figure. Again, if you look before this period, you see various discussions of gender inequality around a lot around occupational segregation, some about within job pay disparities, but this kind of modern economy-wide number really only appears in this moment. And over the next decade and a half, becomes sort of an object of media attention as the Women's Bureau publishes statistics more regularly, drawing on the current population survey and its annual March supplement around income to get good sort of reliable income data that's routinely updated. And along with other trends that were happening in the feminist movement and sort of failures to enforce the Civil Rights Act, helps to actually kickstart the formation of new feminist organizations like the National Organization for Women, because these feminist actors sort of see the pay gap not moving, as I'll show in a slide. That is, in the 1970s, the sort of routine publication of this figure showcased the sort of limitations of the existing models of civil rights enforcement. This is a figure published much later from Claudia Golden's work, which shows the standard gender wage gap. And particularly what's interesting is this period between 1960 and 1980 where the number stagnates. And economists now explain this in part because there's some competing trends where younger women with less experience and education were entering the workforce in large numbers, which kind of brought the number down, even as more women were also entering into management, for example. But at the time, what women activists saw was stagnation. So for example, in 1980, the New York Times published an article about the gender wage gap and argued or wrote, in 1978, the last year for which figures are available, the median salary for working women was only 59 cents that of men, unchanged since 1960. And so this sort of discourse helps kickstart sort of new waves of feminist activism, and in particular leads into the movement for comparable worth. That is the kind of claims that labor feminists were making in the 40s to 60s, which they lost out on in the Equal Pay Act, gets resuscitated as a movement in the 70s and early 80s. In particular, the Equal Opportunity Employment Condition endorses comparable worth and argues that actually the Civil Rights Act does cover that as a form of discrimination. That is, if an employer pays, say, janitors more than it pays maids who do the same kind of work, that would be illegal under Title VII, the EEOC argued at that moment. There's a series of litigation, mostly at the state level, like suing state governments exactly around this kind of discrimination. And there were some initial legal successes. But eventually, by the late 1980s, the courts, including the Supreme Court, basically rule against all of these claims. And there's been a sort of tidal shift in enforcement at the national level as the Reagan administration sort of comes in and takes over and sort of puts the kibosh on this sort of expansion of the Civil Rights Act. Throughout this time, academics are kind of brought in to debate these numbers and explain them, as well as just sort of called upon in the media to talk about gender inequality more broadly. And the typical explanations involve typical human capital kinds of variables, experience, education, occupational segregation, but also this question of the devaluation of women's work, which the last two are argued to be very significant components of this 40 cents on the dollar, 30 cents on the dollar wage gap. As the movement loses steam in the 80s, the conversation shifts. Without a kind of strong feminist movement pushing that angle, the discourse sort of devolves back to one that's focused primarily around choices. And so in particular, in the academic literature, you see a rise of sort of motherhood discourse and discourse around the motherhood penalty, made possible in part by the sort of emergence of longitudinal data sets that now have sort of a life course worth of earnings. And just in generally, again, this increasing discussion of women's choices around career, et cetera. And so even though there's a sort of continued emphasis on things like paycheck fairness and pay transparency and sort of expansions of the Equal Pay Act, there's something of an impasse where the gender wage gap has roughly stagnated, and there's a kind of consistent misunderstanding about what's causing it. Because comparable worth theory is no longer sort of a legal theory that anyone's subscribing to, the kind of occupational segregation, devaluation type stories tend to get much less coverage. And again, much more of the conversation is around career trajectories and women's choices. So you see, for example, in kind of recent conversations, this is a recent Vox article that was covering data from Denmark, but the narrative was sort of applied to the US, as often happens because Denmark has much better data than us. So we like do studies there and then assume it applies here. You see nice data like this showing that women with kids have significant earnings losses compared to men with kids who don't. And there's all sorts of versions of this kind of study. As a result of all this, the sort of conversation is kind of muddied, and it has been the whole time, but sort of the muddiness is different. And so I had a chance to speak with Paula England, who's a top sociologist who's written extensively about the gender wage gap and comparable worth back to the 1980s, and gives talks, has testified before the EEOC, et cetera. And what she writes about is that the hardest thing is that everyone thinks sex discrimination is either hiring discrimination or lack of equal pay for equal work. And these kind of broader structural sorts of discrimination are more distant forms of discrimination around like kinds of jobs and occupational segregation and things like this, just are very hard to get into people's consciousness, even though they're what explains most of what's left of the gender wage gap, probably. One of the things, because there's so much discourse around the gender wage gap, you see some great and funny examples of this. And so, for example, in 2019, the survey firm SurveyMonkey did its own kind of survey in honor of or in support of Equal Pay Day. And so they asked a random panel of Americans what they thought best explained the gender wage gap. But what's hilarious to me, or sort of telling, is that the framing of the question embeds that false understanding of what the number actually meant. And so they write, as you may know, on average, women in the US make 81 cents for every dollar men make for doing similar types of work. That's not true. It's never been true. It's never how the number's been calculated. There was a choice made to calculate it not that way. And yet it's so often assumed to be the case. And I can show you another example from 1974. This sort of misunderstanding is persistent throughout. The confusion also, I think, connects to the way that this kind of narrative is sort of pushed on the conservative side. And so again, I was saying at the beginning, you see kind of a consistent conservative narrative emphasizing the role of choice in these kind of situations. And so again, you'll see discourse from places like AEI arguing that the reality is that men and women make very different work and career choices, play different family roles, et cetera. While gender discrimination undoubtedly occurs, is individuals' choice, not discrimination, which accounts for the vast majority of gender differences in earnings. Again, the sort of binary opposition between choice and discrimination is really interesting. And again, there's a whole long line of feminist critique of that exact framework. But what's important to me is just how I think relatively easy it is for actors like this to push this kind of choice narrative because of how deeply it's embedded in kind of the larger American ideologies of inequality and of folk economics. Finally, the last sort of insight from this historical data dive is that one of the reasons I think, another reason why there's this kind of consistent mismatch between the academic conversation and the public one is because the data used to assess gender inequality are uniquely unsuited to answer the one question everyone assumes they can answer, which is to say we basically don't have data on same work, different pay. So because there's no employer-employee matched data in the US, there are very few papers that can actually look exactly at that question. So a recent publication by top sociologists in the Top Sociology Journal found exactly 5 total papers that had large-scale employer-employee matched data in the US that could examine within job gender gaps in multiple workplaces. And they all look at kind of weird contexts. So for example, this paper is looking specifically at federal science agencies like the NSF and NIH. And those are the contexts in which they have actual data about both the employer, the employees, the gender, and pay. And so because there's so little of this data, gender wage gap academic debate, one of the only questions it can't answer is the question that the Equal Pay Act is sort of premised around, which is, again, different pay for the same job, and the two just don't meet up. So 3 takeaways from this kind of historical analysis. First, again, this gender wage gap is a kind of hinge between academic and political and public conversations, but the conversations are somewhat mismatched. Second, that I think the legal framing around gender inequality strongly shapes people's sort of folk understandings of what's actually happening. People assume that discrimination is equivalent to what's made illegal. What's made illegal is a relatively small set of what one might broadly consider part of the story of discrimination. And then finally, this kind of strong pull of these kind of soft essentialist and abstract liberal ideologies that foreground choices, and particularly women's choices, which are furthered in part by kind of push of conservative voices that reemphasize that narrative. Stepping back more broadly, implications from the sort of broader project. I think there's a real payoff to looking at kind of economist descriptive quantitative research. And looking at kind of more diffuse forms of influence of how economics influences public conversations beyond just sort of narrow policy influence, for example. And to do that, we have to sort of pay attention to the intersection of academic and folk theories. And as a result, when you do that, you learn that sort of controlling for what when you do your descriptive work and other similar kinds of technical choices like what your sample is, are simultaneously deeply political, and it can have significant consequences for how sort of the public at large understands important contemporary social and economic issues like gender inequality. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. Well, we've got plenty of time for Q&A and discussion, and I see we've already had some active back and forth. So I think I'll just start out, kind of bringing to the fore some of the questions that have come up already, and you can kind of answer again for the benefit of all the attendees and panelists. But if you do have questions, please continue to submit those via Q&A or the chat. So first, Giandomenica, Beatrice in the Q&A raised this question about what is the story behind these books or book proposals that Barbara Bergmann put together? Why did they systematically remain unpublished? Why didn't she follow through? What's kind of the backstory there?
Okay, yeah, I tried to answer to Beatrice, but I'm not sure I did it because I'm not much more familiar with the Q&A. So the first one and the last, the first one was completely lost, so it was not published, and there's no way to know why. The first one about children about fatherless children, let's say so. The second unpublished book was rejected by the publisher. There is an email exchange about that. It was not properly rejected, but the publisher asked her to make some significant revisions. And this is the email exchange, but I don't know what's happened later. Probably she dropped out the project and she went through the last project about the decline of marriage in the US. And that book, as I mentioned, converged partially to a working paper she published in 2008. Then Barbara Bergmann got sick quite seriously, and I guess she was not able to follow through. So this is the story by digging the archive of these three unpublished projects. They are they are basically outlined chapters, very, very detailed, with something like 20 pages for each of these book proposals. And then there is the working paper, which is consistent with an appendix with some statistic data about the decline of marriage during the second half of the past century. So this is the story.
Great, great. Chris, I think you already answered some of this question, but
Sure.
I want to sort of ask it again, which is about this emergence of this fifth phase that you all have identified in your network analysis. This is Julia Zacchia's question. So I'll just read it. Could you please better clarify what if the fifth phrase that could be added to the classification of Evelyn Forget and its main characteristics? So I think one of the most exciting things that emerged out of your presentation is exactly this kind of this new stylized fact, to use Dan's framework, that's coming out of this kind of quantitative analysis that you've done. So it'd be great to hear you say some more on that.
So, sorry, can you rephrase, just say that question one more time, distill it?
So the kinds of how would you characterize this kind of fifth phase that you all are identifying?
Sure. So it's not so much that only women are starting to publish a little bit more frequently or a little bit more together as teams. It's that because of this, a byproduct of this is that networks are starting to form. And the idea is that if we can connect subnetworks together, then researchers can kind of use those connections. I don't want to say like, researchers can use those connections to build their network. And there is a whole literature on why peer effects in networks is important. That's it. The whole key is that networks are starting to form and they're starting to connect to one another. So you saw, I had that graphic of the exclusively female network, right? And in it, there was that one big network, but floating around that big network was a whole bunch of tiny little less developed networks. And in the 2010s, right now and moving forward, we're hoping that those networks will start connecting together, and rather than form just random little blobs here and there, they'll start to form a mesh. And in that way, researchers can rely on their networks they can rely on their networks.
Just as a follow-up, I mean, I really liked your terminology of the Ursula Hicks effect.
Sure.
And this was a question that I think Beatrice raised in the Q&A, and it's one that came to my mind as well. Having worked in the past on sort of the rise of quasi-experimental methods, it seems, somewhat anecdotally, if not quantitatively, that the influence of Larry Katz at the QJE and Orly Ashenfelter at the AER were especially important in kind of launching kind of this sort of methodological shift, at least in applied economics. So I think that's maybe a fruitful perspective to bring to some of the work you guys are doing in the future.
Sure. One thing I would add is that every single time I practiced this presentation, I mixed up review of economics and statistics and review of economic studies. Every single time. I did it again.
So Dan, I wanted to ask about sort of the role of, and I know Cleo has worked on this, so maybe she'll chime in with this question, or a better version of this question, which is sort of about the role of lawsuits and kind of the legal wrangling over these kinds of discrimination suits in the U.S. and does that play a role here? Certainly, to me, in my view, I guess it plays a role in sort of the creation of economic expertise on these questions, right? Like, if we're being sued for a sexual discrimination lawsuit, there's a group of people that we're going to go out and hire to defend us. So I was curious about your thoughts on, or how you see that fitting in, if at all.
Yeah, I think in two ways, particularly in the moment, the kind of critical moment in the sort of 70s to 80s. One is that there are this series of important lawsuits around comparable worth, and there's a lot of sort of statistical fighting around those. They're only loosely directly connected to the gender wage gap as a whole, right? Because they're often internal to a single employer, and they're often in terms of the employer's own system for evaluating jobs. So it's very common in this period to use a version of something called the Hayes system, where jobs were given point values based on how much experience they required, how onerous they were, other factors, and then activists, unions could show that the jobs that women held primarily were paid less than the system said they should have been paid. And so basically they would argue that discrimination was provable on the employer's own terms. You've defined how jobs should be valued and you're paying women jobs less than that anyway. And those suits were somewhat successful at first and then eventually undone. What's interesting is that I think that kind of context and the kind of legal wranglings over the Equal Pay Act and Civil Rights Act shape a lot of the interpretations of what people think this number, the larger number, is supposed to mean. And that, I think, to me, is the enduring and unfortunate legacy, is that in the 1970s and 80s, it made some sense to start, for example, the EEOC hearings about about comparable worth open with the gender wage gap number, where the sort of the chairwoman of the committee says, gender wage gap is this, and one of our questions here is, to what extent is the devaluing of women's work explaining that? But as that kind of memory fades and we stop talking about comparable worth and occupational segregation for the most part, because we sort of assume that the problem is solved, even though it's not, people continue to believe that the sort of the macro level equal pay, gender wage gap number is about those things that the law bans. And so this is where the legal consciousness angle comes in, where the sort of this power of law to shape our understandings of what is and what is right, I think is under-recognized in sort of looking at why this is sort of consistently misunderstood, even by activists who have every reason to get it right. We're not trying to undermine the number, but who think that it sort of means something it doesn't.
And a follow-up question, which is coming from Cleo, I see, which is, can you say a little bit more about the role of economists versus other social scientists, sociologists, industrial psychologists in the story that you're telling?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the early story is mostly focused on economists, sort of coming out of labor economics. And there's sort of debates between some networks of men and women to some extent. I haven't done quite enough to say this for certain, but there's sort of some interesting moments where you get some prominent women economists working on an interwage gap, refuting some work that had been just done prior by prominent men economists, particularly sort of arguing against some of these interpretations that are sort of dismissive of various kinds of discrimination or structural barriers. A lot of debates over interpretations of like what the residuals mean in various kinds of regressions, whether that counts as discrimination and so on. Sociologists tend to enter with a somewhat different perspective, but also tend to be kind of, I think, less important in the sense that they are less turned to by the press, for example, to explain what's going on. So you're much more likely to see a quote from Francine Bao or Lawrence Kahn or Claudia Golden than you are to see from Paula England. You do see her occasionally, and almost no one else rises to that level. So I think economists sort of unsurprisingly get most of the attention here. And then the way the gender wage gap works in sociology is super interesting because, again, it's invoked a lot kind of ritually at the beginning of papers to say like, oh, there's this gender wage gap. Let's see if this thing explains it, which is, again, not that different from economics, but then often the thing explaining it is much more qualitative and kind of like a mechanism rather than like a decomposition, say. So I do think they both play a role. And you do see sociologists sometimes testifying, for example, before various commissions and things, but I think economists sort of dominate the story, at least in the kind of these formative periods.
Yeah, super interesting. So Giandomenica, I had a question. I haven't quite worked out completely in my head, but the title of your project kind of juxtaposes feminist economics, which is sort of has a self-consciousness as, you know, both a society and a journal and a group of active, you know, researchers at a given point in time and currently, versus what you call, I think you call gender neoclassical gender economics, which I guess my feeling is doesn't have that same kind of self-consciousness. It sort of exists within sort of the mainstream. And maybe more recently, there's been kind of an emergence of a gender economics field, but, you know, it's not something that, say, appears in like the JEL codes per se. You know, if I'm someone who works on gender pay gaps, you know, I'm a labor economist, right? I'm not. I think I've seen job market candidates who now say that they work on gender economics. So I was curious if you could say a little bit more about kind of this juxtaposition of these two.
Right. Yeah, I tried to tell this story in the book, in my recent book, and by using the JEL codes precisely. And the idea was that the history of JEL codes, it's very useful to understand this division between, let's say, the use of standard economic theory to deal with gender issues and the rejection of using standard economic theory to deal with gender issues. So during the 70s, gender issues within economics started in a more systematic way and got a JEL code. That was household economics, and thereafter new home economics. That was a label used by Mincer and Baker to specify their own research as a whole. That was a D JEL code. I don't remember exactly the number, but it was D, so household economics, and was a new home economics was within the J, so labor economics, basically. Economists who didn't agree with that type of use of the standard economic theory to cope with gender issues started to think to alternative way. And so feminist economists somehow decided to split from that group and to reject why they split, because they rejected the standard, they rejected Baker's and followers of Baker's treatment of gender issues. And then feminist economics, as the international association was founded in early 90s. The journal the academic journal Feminist Economics was founded in 1995. And finally, only in 2006, feminist economics got a JEL code. That was B. And B for American Economic Review is for heterodox economics. So you can find whatever from Austrian economics to post-Keynesian to Marxist economics, including feminist economics. But only later in 2006, because the research field, meanwhile, has grown up with the academic journal, with the association, with the conference, and so forth. So finally, they got that JEL code that was heterodox. I mean, it was a subset of the heterodox economic theory, while New Home Economics is in another JEL code classification, which is the mainstream. So this is the story, the recent story, even though their roots is much older, both of the roots of the two research fields.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I want to encourage people to keep submitting questions over the Q&A. One question I wanted to raise for Chris and the research team, given that some of these recent women co-author networks are relatively small, and there's relatively few of them, I wonder if there might be simple ways to kind of zero in a little bit and just do some qualitative kind of summaries of some of what are the common factors amongst the kind of nodes in these networks? Is it advisor-student relationships? Is it common institutions? I mean, broadly, these are, I imagine, people who work in the same field, but even within field, are they working on the same kind of some of the same sites even? Are they doing field work in India or sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera? I'd be kind of curious on kind of the nature of some of the, which would speak a little bit to how these nodes and how these networks are formed, which was kind of the endogeneity issues that you raised earlier. But I think we could learn a lot just given that there's not that many of them, just from some simple summaries.
And the answer to that is it's very, very idiosyncratic. So I looked at them. There's only like 10 or 11 little tiny networks, and then it starts going into nothing. It starts going into just one co-authorship connection. So we tried to get trends. So one trend would be that they tend to be held together by someone who's an editor or a very senior, well-published person, but that kind of holds by construction almost. So for example, like our number one node was held together by that inner ring of that inner ring. Our number two network was held together by Amy Finkelstein. Our number three was like Hilary Hoynes. And then there's like there's one that's really Russian. There's one that's Asian. It kind of changes from subnetwork to subnetwork.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, like, and even if we did identify a trend, like there's not really enough data to call it a trend. Maybe I guess that depends on you, but yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I see a follow-up question here popping up from Ross Emmett. So I'll go ahead and read it. Is there an economic rationale for why the networks don't form collaborations? Perhaps they can increase their journal publications if they don't cross networks. Yeah, kind of getting at this, how are these networks formed kind of question.
So the question is there an economic reason why these networks aren't bridging? And the answer is simply lack of female co-authorships in the top 5, top 6. There's not enough So there's a good, healthy amount of papers that are one male, one female, or female, male, male. But there's very few that are female, female, and there's even fewer that are female, female, female. That's what would really be needed to bridge the networks, because that's what forms the connections, right? And if those connections aren't being formed, then they aren't being formed.
May I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's somewhat unstated, but I think I'd like to hear you say it. Why do you think it's specifically important that there become a formation of a sort of female-female co-author network, rather than just more women present in mixed co-author networks? Not coming from a place of criticism or skepticism, I'm just curious to hear you articulate what you think are the most important reasons why.
Okay, let me think for 1 second.
Good question.
Why is it important for female-female networks to develop rather than just females generally? Is kind of stumping me. We don't can I pass? Can I take a pass on that? Or if anyone else wants to answer that, please go ahead.
It looks like Cleo wants to chime in here, perhaps.
Can I say something about that? It's made me think about the Bechdel test. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's for assessing the degree of feminism, simplifying, of a movie.
Right.
And it's
oh, yeah.
If there is more than one woman character, if there is two, and if when they talk, they're not talking about a male character. And I think there is a story interesting in between women and women collaboration in terms of the mentorship. Also, I don't know if there is a different way to experience in a profession, those networks that are I don't know. There is a lot of literature on collaboration that is usually interesting in that, from safe space to the different outcome that it could produce, but also so I don't know if it's the Bechdel test of collaboration. I don't know, I just think about this.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, it strikes me that it seems likely that a lot of these, I would guess that these female or women co-author networks tend to be concentrated in certain subfields, where women tend to be disproportionately represented relative to some, say macro or finance. So in some ways, that may kind of skew the picture. It's not necessarily representative of women's progress in the economics profession per se. It's saying something different also. Dan, I wanted to add, so you cited this work by, I think it was a group at the Bureau of Labor Statistics?
Women's Bureau, yeah.
The Women's Bureau, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about the history of this group. Were they a group employing professional social scientists and economists? Because then I guess my bigger question is sort of the relationship between knowledge about this produced within academia versus outside of academia, and and where women fall in terms of producing that knowledge themselves, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and fantastically, there's an entire book written with the Women's Bureau and its history that I highly recommend by Laughlin. The name's not escaping me right now, but if you just search Women's Bureau, and it's the history of this organization, and it goes quite far back actually. It's an organization. It's very much a research organization within the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or connected to it, but it also has sort of deep ties to various kinds of feminist activism. And interestingly enough, for the first kind of decade of its existence, because it's formed in the early 20th century, it sees itself as the guardian of so-called protective legislation, which is to say, before World War II and before the mid-20th century, there was a lot of labor law that only applied to women and children. And there's sort of different legal standards held for laws that apply to women and children versus laws that applied to everyone. Minimum wage laws and working hours laws were legal if they applied to women and men in certain places, women in certain places, but not if they applied to everyone or if they applied to men. And so there was there was a kind of a move to get rid of these laws or to make them sort of uniform. And the Women's Bureau actually fought against that for many years, well past kind of most feminist movement kind of moving on from that into the 60s and 70s. And they actually was sort of part of the rearguard action against the Equal Rights Amendment because they feel it would get rid of these kind of extra protections for women. So the Women's Bureau has a really interesting place in the feminist movement, sphere of activism, but at the same time, they did a lot of kind of statistical work just showing gender inequality in the economy that sort of no one else was doing, using their access to and their professional capacities as social scientists, access to data, government data. And so yes, it's a really interesting group in history. By the late 70s becomes kind of just sort of more tightly connected with the sort of, at that point, mainstream feminist movement, the sort of second wave, and less connected to these kind of older attempts to sort of to push for this more separate model of equality, you might say. So yeah, they have really interesting history. They are professional. They are mostly trained social scientists with degrees in economics and similar fields. I'd say they're interesting to me for a couple of reasons, but one is that they take on the task of producing the raw data, like producing the not raw data, the sort of the stylized fact. They become the place where people go for that particular number. They don't do most of the interpretive work. Academics do most of that. So the kind of debates over the various regression decompositions or other kinds of ways of explaining that gender wage gap mostly fall on academics. And so they will sometimes do work at summarizing that kind of research, but they're not the ones kind of producing for most of it. That's mostly happening in sort of like econ journals or social journals. So I think they have a particularly important role in the kind of early moments of the statistic taking hold, because they're the ones actually going into the CPS and analyzing it in the 60s and 70s, and that is not a trivial thing to do, to produce this particular calculation and put it on the agenda. And they get it and put it into sort of prominent reports and things and start getting written up. But they're not mostly doing the work of sort of analyzing its significance, which falls to, on the one hand, activist groups, on the other hand, academics, and a sort of intersection of those two.
A follow-up question that comes from Bud Collier. Would you happen to know whether the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress has held hearings specifically on the gender wage gap?
That's a great question, and I should know the answer, and I don't. There are various hearings, and someone mentions the EEO's, the Commission on Civil Rights hearings, which I've been reading recently, and there are others. There are similar other ones held by the EEOC and things. So there's a bunch of hearings. I don't know if the JEC had one specifically in the wage gap titled exactly that. It comes up a lot in various hearings around gender inequality, but I don't know the answer off the top of my head. Yeah.
And to come back to an earlier question for you, Giandomenica, coming from Shoshana Grossbard, she asks, do you think that the new home economics still exists sort of as a field in this kind of historical perspective? And I think this kind of gets a little bit at some of the earlier points we were discussing. So I'd be curious, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay. New home economics now does not exist anymore, as Becker thought about it, mainly because economists who were inspired and developed his own model were aware of some critical points from a technical point of view of Becker's new home economics. And in fact, if we use the JEL codes, now there is no longer a JEL code for new home economics. I mean, JEL codes are changing periodically because they are describing the development of the discipline. So at a certain point, a few years ago, the label new home economics disappeared because there was no longer a home economics as Becker had in mind. As I mentioned before, because his own followers who were inspired by him modified the model, but still they are using the standard economic theory. And the question by Jennifer Cohen, I guess it's quite related with this. Yes, definitely now what is gender neoclassical economics is absolutely covered by the JEL code D1, which is household behavior and family economics, definitely. what I think about what Barbara would think about feminist economics as a heterodox. Yeah, I think so, yes, because she definitely was one of the most strenuous opponent of standard economic theory. She was not alone, of course. Nancy Folber, Julie Nelson, and many more. I cannot mention all of the feminist economists of the at the very beginning of this research field. But yes, definitely, I think that because Barbara Bergmann plenty of times wrote down that she was different from standard economists of her time. So yes, definitely, I think that the answer is yes. And what are the broader implications in economic thought if the rejection of stereotypes is marginalized as out of the mainstream? This is a very crucial question, because it's related with Julie Nelson claimed, and I briefly mentioned in the presentation. The idea is that probably standard economists keep going in using the standard methodology in order to cover with the technical abilities some ideological elements which are very, it's a kind of a justification of discrimination, something like that. It's a very dangerous aspect of the discipline. It's easy to use technicalities in order to explain and somehow justify the status quo. And this is precisely what the feminist economics rejected. Not only the technical aspect of the standard economic theory, but the fact that technicalities, that set of technicalities somehow justify the status quo.
So I think one of our panelists, Dan may have to leave here, and I think we're kind of reaching the end of the question queue. But this has been a great discussion, but I would encourage, I think we've got a few minutes left, especially any questions for Christopher or Giandomenica. The other thing I would add, though, these kind of virtual settings, right? They've sort of dramatically reduce the cost of these kinds of gatherings, which is great, but the rub of it is it's dramatically increased the cost of these kinds of side conversations that often happen in conferences outside of the meeting rooms. And so one thing I would encourage both the attendees and the panelists is reach out over email. You don't always think of a question necessarily during the session itself, but I think these kinds of side questions are important to kind of the collaborative research efforts that we're all engaged in.
Yeah, cool. I think this went well. For many of you, you've done this. This is my first Zoom webinar this is my first economics seminar in my life. So
well, congrats. Good to be a part of it. Yeah, no, I'll personally say, I'm really looking forward to the conference coming this July, hopefully. I think we've got an exciting group of papers, and I see there's a lot of potential connections between the papers that I hope, that meeting, I hope will kind of help us, foster the development of some common themes that can emerge from that gathering. So, I think we could probably go ahead and sign off. So I want to thank again, everyone, all the panelists and all the attendees for their questions. And I'm looking forward to future conversations and future discussions on all these topics and issues. Thanks a lot, everyone. And take care and stay safe.